So, how does kind of regular in-country non-robocall spoofing, how does that kind of business work? What's the creative? And ideally, you've got highly trained and motivated. It's a very highly commissioned business, by the way. And junior sellers working from a script. Like these guys, they unfortunately need to get harassed, I guess, and pumped up. At least that's what Ben Affleck thinks, to close more business. So let's just move along here. So this is something I showed kind of early in the presentation. Obviously, Jean-Paul Basquiat influenced artwork here. So who's on the other side makes a big difference in terms of whether the telemarketing effort is basically benevolent or malevolent. Is it good or is it evil? And here's Alice in Wonderland. This is the second book. Alice Through the Looking Glass. And what is on the other side of the looking glass? Is it benevolent or malevolent? And so let's get into our discussion now of some new technologies. And these are pretty much things that have to do with outbound B2C, which is the evil clown of and the invasive part of telemarketing. So we're going to talk about voice over internet protocol, talk a little bit about robocalls, spoofing, and neighbor spoofing, and some legislation and some things that are dealing with these problems. And we're kind of winding things down. We're getting there, folks. In fact, just to keep everybody more or less on track in terms of where we are, I'm going to go way back up here. If I can find our agenda. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. I don't know. Let's see. There it is. Okay, so where are we now? Okay, looking back. Okay. Yeah, definition of telemarketing, brief history with Alexander Graham Bell and exchanges and rotary phones and dial phones, the history of telemarketing, really picking up in the 80s and 90s when we had dial phones and then computers and voice over internet and call centers and all kinds of things, 800 numbers for inbound and outbound. Then we talked about the four kinds, which I'm not going to repeat for the millionth time. We're now down to number 5, which is the controversies and legislation, as I said. And then players won't take very long because you're not going to recognize any of the agencies anyway. But remember, a lot of these things are in-house, at least except for the B2C outbound. We're then going to, this is particularly for the media class, review CPM again. We touched on it a bit, and then talk about the quality of the overall impression. And then finally, we'll talk about kind of where we are with things these days and beyond, and try to wrap things up a little bit. So let me see if I can go back to where we were. Where were we, everyone? There's Salesforce. Yeah, there's, what's his name? There's Clowney. Yeah, so I think we're here. Okay, gang. So, all right. So VoIP is Voice over Internet Protocol. It sounds fancy, but it's basically that your voice call goes over the internet instead of through the copper phone line. So most of us at home now have our cable, our internet, and they usually throw in a landline so-called phone, all on the same system, and it's all going over the internet. It's going over coaxial cable. So all of the phone calls are digital, They have a slightly different quality than the old copper wires that were around for so long. But because it's over the internet, it means there are things, and it's touch tone, it means there are things that can be done that aren't so wonderful for those of us on the receiving end. Pros and cons of voice over internet protocol. It's cheaper, portable, okay, flexible, accessible, integration with other apps, improved productivity. The cons are voice quality, as you can see, bandwidth dependent, power dependent, emergency call concerns. Security is, of course, the problem here. Okay. And there's somebody doing robocalls. Computerized auto dialer to deliver a pre-recorded message as if from a robot. They're often associated with political and telemarketing phone campaigns, but can also be used for public service or emergency announcements, don't forget. By the way, anyone who has, as you can see here, has a phone number can get them because their robocalling is illegal. But if someone's on the other side is a scofflaw, as it says here, they will scoff the laws. They do get caught sometimes. But it's not illegal by political candidates and charities. And then this is an ad for a company. I think you can buy a membership to their robocall avoidance service for $2 a month or something like that. But anyway, I'm not going to show you that. So as of November 2019, U.S. users had received 54 billion robocalls for the year 2019, up from 48 billion the previous year, according to this company, Umail. Consumer Reports says, which is a great publication, very unbiased, 70% of U.S. consumers say they don't answer the phone if they don't recognize the caller's number. 62% say they let most calls go to voicemail. This is from a congressional hearing where they talked about the latest sort of anti-robocall legislation that was passed called the TRACED Act, which we'll look at in just a minute. But this is, you can see, the number of robocalls filed each month for the past few years, filed with the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, so hundreds of thousands of robocalls. This is complaints about robocalls received each calendar year from 2003 up through, this is January through May 2013, so it's not very recent, but you can see it's millions and millions, 221 million, complaining. And this is kind of interesting. This is a globe, a flattened out globe, showing all the different entities and where they can be based in the world in different countries, all for the same robocall campaign, where you've got a telemarketer somewhere in, I don't know, Connecticut or New Jersey. You've got a telephone carrier. The telemarketer is working through different voice over internet protocol, what's called a qualifier. There's an auto dialer way off somewhere else. And it all somehow gets back to the cell phone in the U.S. But these calls, robocalls, are routed all over the place, so they become very hard to track the origin. Okay. Cheap and scalable model for robocalls. So this is starting with a telemarketer. This is the bad guy or gal on the left here. This phone number's fake caller ID info and pre-recorded message provides that to the auto dialer. Live calls get transferred to the qualifier. The qualifier calls get transferred to the telemarketer. So if someone picks up the phone, it gets transferred back to the telemarketer. See, okay? Now what's added to it, by the way, before it goes? You get the spoofing, the mustache in the nose. So you get a fake number put on as the origin phone number. etc. And anyway, it goes through the VoIP services, it goes through phone carriers, and eventually gets to through the internet to the telephone, the DSTN, to the telephone carriers and the cell phone. So that's the system. It's got phone numbers, recorded message, fake ID, going to the auto dialer. Auto dialer adds the spoofing element, goes through voice over internet protocol, and eventually rings to the person's cell phone. If they pick up, it goes back to the qualifier and gets transferred back to the telemarketer. That's why it can take a while after you pick up to hear from, oh, hello. You get the recorded message, but anyway. Okay, now here's a little bit about the money flow. On the upper left, there's someone who's selling the lead list. There's someone who's selling a voice recording. There's the person who provides the caller ID, the spoofing. There's a caller ID database that they're getting the spoofing information from. And if it's neighbor spoofing, they're actually reading into your phone well, first of all, they have your area code already, so they can add that to anything. But they can also pull from recent calls you've made to try to match some of the first 7 numbers. But the money flow is the telemarketer pays money to lead list seller, voice recording seller, spoofer, and sends them, and they send him or her information. All that gets sent to the auto dialer, also gets paid by the telemarketer, and then now we go to the consumer's phone carrier, etc., etc. And then the money, of course, goes from the person who picks up the phone and buys whatever it is, or gives the credit card number to get their grandson out of jail, whatever it is. When that money happens, sometimes $3,000 or $4,000, right? I have a friend who's a very bright man and a great businessman who was tricked into thinking this was his grandson on the phone and gave his credit card number and gave $4,000 to supposedly get the grandson out of jail, which got split among all these purveyors, all these nice people. And as I said, this is from this month's AARP. You see, you get the latest and the hottest publications when you have me as your professor. So here's a bunch of things going on. Indian robocall ripoffs. And a lot of these are over the phone. COVID-19 cybercons and frauds. There are even things going on for COVID now, fraudulent things. And again, a lot of these are over the phone. AARP is for old people. Spoofing. So you heard about VoIP. We talked about how robocalling. Spoofing is, making the origin number look familiar. It can be used on emails, phone calls, and websites. Okay. Neighbor spoofing, as I said before, is, the area code and the first 3 numbers can be pulled off your own caller ID or whatever and make it look like it's someone living near you and a neighbor. So here's the advice that is given by this particular publication. Nomorobo, by the way, that is the name of a company that charges the $2 to avoid robocalls. You're welcome to look into that if you want to spend $2 a month. So I'm going to stop now, and we're all really almost done, everybody. You'll be glad to hear. We're going to talk about legislation, the TCPA, the Traced Act, and we'll move it right along. So I'll be back on the other end.